Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lothar Lieg. I'm working here at the Agency for Safety and Health at Work and have the pleasure to moderate this workshop. We have registered 75 participants in this workshop, so there should be a few more come. I will introduce you shortly into the organization and the content of this workshop before I present the speakers and the panelists. So, first of all, we have, besides English, one more language, that is Spanish. So if you like to listen it in the presentations and discussions in Spanish, you should choose channel 2. And if you want to ask a question in Spanish, you can use channel 2 also. The Wi-Fi, we showed it already in the plenary, but we don't know whether everybody who is now in this workshop was in the plenary. This is the Wi-Fi here for this house. And we also explained this little interactive instrument called Slido, which allows us to ask you questions and display your answers here on the screen, and which allows you to formulate questions. We will test it soon with a fun question, but wait a second. You need to use your mobile phone for that. As I said, we will test it soon. You need your mobile phone, but for the sake of this discussion and the speakers, please don't switch it off, but put it on silent mode so that we don't hear this ringing like in previous Hitchcock movies. You might remember them. So, as I said, this is my name, Senior Project Manager at EU-OSHA. We will have 3 presentations. Ioannis Bassinis, you see him there in the middle. We'll start with a development of exposures at workplaces. We will then have a lecture from Faisal Mushtaq on impact of regulatory actions on substance registrations under REACH. We will continue with Stefan Engel on behalf of the I don't know how to pronounce that, German or English, VCI, the Association of the German Chemical Industry. He's Director of Industrial Hygiene at BASF. It is on practices in enterprises today and tomorrow. We will have on the panel, in addition, Arndt Spahn. Arndt Spahn is Secretary of the Agricultural Workers Union, the European. You will find some of the booklets here on the shares, and continue with Chris de Meester. You saw him already in the plenary, Business Europe and the Belgian Employers Federation. And by the way, member of the jury for the Good Practice Award winners. These are the 2 further panelists. So, you have your headphone? Yeah, I'm quite sure. So, the aim of this workshop is to discuss, as mentioned, the future challenges for effective prevention. I will not start a kind of own lecture on this, but 1-2 sentences. We wanted to go a little bit beyond the permanent challenges of prevention and ask what can we do as a kind of bigger steps to come closer to, let's say, less risks from dangerous substances at workplaces. So it's a little bit beyond the daily work, and we have on our panel some decades of experience on dangerous substances, on occupational safety and health, and we hope that this combined, summarized experience will inspire us to find some solutions, or at least ideas for future prevention towards dangerous substances at workplaces. So, before we start, we test again our Slido. Now you can see how we are tested by technological. Katalin? Yeah, this is the question. So how many pinchos, these are these little tapas similar sandwiches, did you eat this night or today? Can you see this question? Yeah. So it works. Yeah. Okay, very good. So that was only the test. So we'll come now to our first presentation. I would like to invite Ioannis Bassinas. I have to switch here a little bit onto this one. And here you are. Yeah. Every speaker, please be a little bit careful. Here is a test for your occupational safety and health mentality. I would prefer a technical solution, but this time you have to take care yourself. It's a little step here.
Thank you, Lothar. Before starting, I would like to thank the organizing committee and Lothar for the invitation actually to give this talk today, and it's really a pleasure being among you. Actually, what I'm going to talk about is development of exposures of the European workplaces in the last decade, actually, and prospects for the future. And I think that it's important, before starting, to define what actually we mean by developments. By developments, actually, we mean changes in quantitative changes in exposure, quantities of use, manufacture, levels that the workers are exposed to, and the number of workers themselves. These are very, very important information, which if we are able actually to monitor, surveil those in time, then that can be very, very fruitful, because it will allow effectively, a constant surveillance will allow an identification of emerging issues and act as an early warning system. It will also assist, because we will be able to detect early, of making informed decisions and better plan policy and develop policies in relation to that. And of course, it will increase the effectiveness of any action that we may take. And we, at present, we lack such a system. And the question is, although that is very important, is it possible to establish such system, and is it possible to establish it with currently available information? So that's actually what we tried to look upon on a study that was performed within the framework of the Healthy Workplaces campaign a couple of years ago, where actually we tried to develop and pilot a scientific method that could be utilized to assess and monitor trends in exposure to dangerous substances at an EU level. And then within the piloting exercise, we wanted also to use this methodology in order to identify those substances and the related actually industrial sectors that were of greatest concern regarding the exposure and health protection of workers at present. Getting a bit onto the methodological side, I'll try to be, brief and not very technical. But what we did was rather simple. There is a breadth, actually, of public and non-public available data at an EU and country level. And by saying non-public, lots of EU collected data that can be available to researchers if you apply for that. But now what we actually did was looking on the public available part of this. And there is a breadth of information, as I already mentioned, and some examples include, for example, in relation to employment and business characteristics, the European Working Conditions Survey, structural business statistics, labor force survey, surveys actually that they're performed at an EU level. And I'm not going to get into the details of how they're performed and what they cover, but they're easily and straightforwardly accessible. There are databases in relation to the substances that are used across industries and their potential attributes, like the ECHA lists of registered substances where the REACH dossiers are registered, the classification and labeling inventory, the CLP inventory, which is attached to this. And also databases in relation to substance and article use characteristics, where actually information in relation to the quantities of substances that are produced or used within industries can be found, like the substances in preparation in Nordic countries, or so-called SPIN database, which covers actually use of dangerous substances and non-dangerous substances, of course, within actually the 4 Nordic countries, or upstream data at an EU level, like the so-called PROVCOM database. And what we effectively did is that we took these databases, we combined them on a project, a common database, using actually and linking the information on the basis of certain attributes that they're common between them, such as the occupation and industrial codes that have been used, which are more or less in most cases standardized on the basis of standard classification systems, like the International Standard Classification of Occupational System, or the NACE, which actually classifies industries at an EU level with some deviations within countries, and also substance identification numbers, such as the so-called international CAS numbers, which can be used to actually, which are used actually as a standard naming process in relation to substances themselves. So, getting a brief outline in relation to what we did, so we took this information, we put them on a common database. We started from the European Working Conditions Survey, where actually we looked upon the prevalence of exposure to dangerous substances at EU level. This is a survey where actually workers within EU workplaces, they're asked for several things in relation to the work, and one of them is whether they're exposed to certain categories of substances and physical exposures. We actually use this information in order to identify industries where exposure to dangerous substance is of relevance. We then took these industries and we went into the employment databases of the EU that I previously mentioned. We actually looked at the size and the prevalence of the data of the industries actually across the EU. Then we identified those that they were likely the most representative. We passed on this list that we developed on the ECHA list and the CLP inventory of the ECHA list of dangerous substances, where actually we identified the substances that have been used within those industries, and then subsequently we looked on the articulate databases that I previously mentioned in order to see for which we had data. We identified the dangerous substances that they had data through this process, and subsequently we took those and we went into a panel actually of 3 experts, where actually we asked them to score those substances within this list on the basis of their importance, using actually 3 criteria related to the number of workers potentially exposed within an industry, the likelihood of the exposure occurrence, and the impact of exposure on health and working and social life of the workers themselves. We also asked them to identify whether we had any missing substances. We calculated an overall score of importance, and we subsequently used that score in order to rank the substances and identify those that they are of most importance at present. That's briefly the methodology that it has been applied, and looking actually on what you could see by doing this process. And I must mention that we used very strict criteria on the selection because of the timescales that we did the work. At first step, we had actually, and by the EWCS, the European Working Conditions Service analysis, we found approximately 33 industries actually that they had a prevalence of exposure above 30%. And we actually tried to restrict this number by excluding those that they were present in less than half of the EU countries, or they were very small in workforce. This does not mean, of course, that they are not of importance. We need to highlight that, or those that they were in decline within the EU. And a good example in this case is the coal mining, which, of course, is phased out slowly. Again, it doesn't mean that it's not important. And we also actually overlooked the heavily regulated industries, such as the manufacture of pharmaceutical products. That resulted in 26 industries, which were actually included in the identification of substances relevant to them. We took these industries, we looked on the ECHA lists of dangerous substances, we identified the substances of relevance on the basis of the CLP inventory, those that actually they had health effects, and not only. So the definition of the dangerous substances were sourced from the CLP. We actually took the list of substances identified there, and we had, when looked on the articulate databases, 2,820 actually substances across 24 industries where we had data to look upon. We again applied some strict criteria to further scrutinize this list. You know, because we're talking about only Nordic data on the SPIN database, for example, we actually looked on those that they were more or less present in all 4 Nordic countries, because that will likely increase the relevance in relation to an industry being present at an EU level. And we also excluded those that they had minimal levels, minimal actually amounts of use. We had another 24 substances that they have been identified as important by the experts and literature actually reading. So we ended up with a list actually of 319 substances across the 26 industries, mostly from the manufacture of chemicals and the trade and repair of motor vehicle sectors. Of those, actually, those 319 entries corresponded to 142 substances, dangerous substances at an individual level. I'm sorry, that shouldn't look like this. I don't know. It should be green. Well, I think that it's a bit. Nevertheless, at least you can see the important numbers, you know, which effectively, you know, it's those that they were ranked from 6 and above, and you know, it was approximately 36% of these 319 substances that they had achieved the rating by the experts that there was above 6, and 19 they were scored by the experts as very, very important and relevant, having an overall score of importance of 8 and 9. And here you have a cloud actually where you can see an outline of the substances that they were included on those lists. Those 19 actually highlighted as very important combinations of industry and substances corresponding to 15 unique dangerous substances identified from the process of the expert scoring, and we used you know, a cross tabulation in order to do that. I'm not going to get into the details, but it was a pretty comprehensive process also with more or less having a third, well, we used 3 reviewers. The third one was actually used also in order to reach some kind of consensus in relation to any disagreements that we had between the experts. You can see the most important substances identified by the experts in this process, ranging from heavy metals, pesticides, wood dust, asbestos, crystalline silica, as well as solvents and some bioaerosols. We then asked the experts to put 5 proposals for the most important, actually dangerous substance from this list. They ended up actually of suggesting asbestos, intentional and accidental exposure in construction as being of high importance at present, crystalline silica in construction, mining and other manufacturing industries, non-infectious biological agents in the waste industry and more widely, solvents in the printing industry, and wood, dust and forestry, as highlighting as being the most important at present. We went a step further and asked them to highlight the 2 most important of those. They went back and said that crystalline silica in construction and other industries and non-infectious biological agents are probably the most relevant in this case. And the reasons actually that they put behind this thinking was at the time, you know, that in relation to the crystalline silica, there was no EU occupational exposure limit in place. I'm aware that this is at present being developed, whereas silica is a cross-industry issue. It's also a process-generated substance, not only used directly on manufacturing, whereas previous results on health and economical impact analysis suggested, performed as part of the CCAN study, that's been actually back in mid-2000, they suggested that actually 5.3 million workers approximately were exposed into silica on the basis of the data available in 2006, and attributing approximately to 5,000 annual deaths attributed to silica exposure on occupational environments. And another important factor that they highlighted is that construction actually is not part of the European Network for Silica, or the so-called NEPSI, which is actually an initiative by the industry itself aiming to promote actually good working practices and reduce exposure of silica in European workplaces. In relation now to non-infectious biological agents in the waste industry and more widely, again, the argument was that there are no OELs in place, and in this case, you know, it's not only an EU level, a problem at an EU level, it's more broadly. Exposure for these agents is very difficult to control, because we're talking about agents that they're sourced from living organisms and microbes also, which they have the ability to self-multiply. There are agents actually with strong pro-inflammatory and allergenic potential, which lead to long-term diseases like COPD and asthma, with large socioeconomic impact on the daily life of those exposed. Of course, taking into account also that recycling is a new industry which is in constant growth. And to put things a bit in perspective and see actually how this data that they are available and they were used, they look like. On the left here you have some data actually which show oh, what happened? Sorry, I went a bit too fast, so better not use it. So on the left side, actually, you have usage data employment data in relation to European workplaces and foreign industries. What is very nice to see there is when you look on the employment figures in relation to construction, you can see actually downward trend following 2008, which could likely be attributed, to the financial crisis at the time, which actually is getting inversed and employment start raising on following actually 2013. A bit more of a complicated figure in relation to the use of quartz and in manufacturing and construction. You need to consider, as I've already mentioned before, that this is a process-generated substance. There are much more data of this kind on the published material, which you can find on the OSH wiki and the EU-OSHA website. You have a link here in relation to the core of this material. Looking a bit on the non-infectious biological agents, here you have the waste industry, where actually you can see very nicely this upward trend in employment that continues for 8 years in the past. It still continues at present, and is more likely, to increase even further employment on this industry on the basis of the legislation that is passing towards recycling of materials at an EU level. Again, in this case, we have a process-generated substance, so we don't have data in relation to amounts in this case, but you will find, if you go back on the material that is available on the website, you will find some values in relation to exposure quantities relevant to the workers themselves, exposure levels, and the discussion around them. Now, very briefly looking a bit on the limitations of what you have just seen, of course, there are several limitations on this approach. There are mainly Nordic data that have been used. Data that they are available do not cover process generated. I need to mention, though, that, besides Nordic data, there are similar databases from other countries. It's just that in this case, it was the Nordic data that were most convenient to be dragged within this process and tested, piloted on this methodology. The follow-up period that we applied was less than 10 years, and there was strict criteria. You need to consider that what we were trying to see is whether this could function, and if it was possible. We used only UK-based experts, mainly from our institution, though renowned exposure scientists and with an occupational hygiene background. We need to highlight that the developed methods can be further tailored and improved, for example, by removing these limitations, as well as strengthening and enlarging the databases available, which can take place in a bit of a longer format, but still, there are public available databases that can be utilized. So to get back and conclude, by answering first of all the question that I just posed in the beginning, yes, actually this pilot process has shown that a methodology that monitoring and surveillance actually of the trends in exposure at an EU level is possible, and the methodology can be developed, not looking actually on complicated data where actually access to them is restricted, but simply by looking at those data that they are available at the public domain within the EU. With this, actually, I would like to close by thanking my colleagues at the Institute of Occupational Medicine, particularly Peter Risi, Dr. Richard Graveling, and Professor John Cherry, as well as from EU-OSHA, Dr. Lothar Liek and Elke Snyder for the constant support and input within this work. Thank you for your time and attention.
Yeah, thank you, Ioannis. This was one step to cope better with future, getting data in a, let's say, not so expensive, simple and fast way from public sources. The next two steps are now, what can we learn from the ECHA regulations, which impact they have now, Faisal Mushtaq, and then we come to what is the industry already doing. Okay, I think I'll do that, I hope. No. Only this one. No, sorry. The top one?
Oh.
No, this one.
Yeah. I don't know where the top one is really.
Okay, sorry for this.
Thank you very much. I almost fell as well, so I've forgotten about it already. So thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak here. When Lothar first contacted me, he was interested in trends that might be seen from the ECHA registration database. And unfortunately, especially in terms of the tonnages and things like that we're talking about, it doesn't really lend to that kind of information. The registration database is very much focused on hazard data, and that doesn't work with trends. So in our discussions, we then talked about this topic of prevention. For ECHA, that means substituting a substance or reducing exposure in some way. And then we talked about where regulatory actions might lead to that. So this presentation is more about how we then decide on those regulatory actions, the impact of those regulatory actions, and then what about those substances where we don't take any regulatory action? How are those handled? So this is my content slide. I'm going to talk about the knowledge generated under REACH, the regulatory actions we can take, so how we come to those actions and the impacts of them, and then communication in the supply chain. That is supposed to take care of all the substances which are maybe not so hazardous. So the regulatory actions are only for the most hazardous substances. Now, to make this presentation, I had to go to different areas of the house in ECHA, because I don't work in all of these areas, so they've all provided me a lot of input. I've got maybe too many slides, and I'm going to skip through some of them quite quickly, but I've left some links for those who are interested. There's some projects behind, and if they click those links, they can read about those projects. So I've made this diagram to try and fit together the knowledge which comes from the REACH registration information, where manufacturers and importers make their registrations and they provide information on their substances, mainly the hazard data, to ECHA, into this registration database. And then authorities use that information via this integrated regulatory strategy to actually decide on whether or not a regulatory action is required and what that regulatory action should be. And then at this bottom left side, in the purple zone, we have the less hazardous substances. So manufacturers and importers who have generated this information are also supposed to communicate down the supply chain via safety data sheets to tell their customers, the users of the chemicals, the substances or mixtures, how to use those chemicals safely. And there's also foreseen a feedback which doesn't work exactly as well as it could. And there's some challenges there, and I'm going to describe some of those challenges and what we're doing in ECHA to try to overcome them. So it's about what we're doing at the moment, the challenges for the future, challenges for now, and how we're going to resolve those challenges in the future. So firstly, this integrated regulatory strategy. So dealing with the data and deciding on the regulatory action. There is a document there which describes the background. For myself, I will mainly say that we have, if we focus on the top half of the diagram, we have two different types of registrations. We consider those substances registered above 100 tons a year, and the bottom half is those registered below 100 tons a year. And we have on the right-hand side these green circles. So for the top half, we have around 700 substances for which we don't need to take any further action. So either they are low hazard or they're already sufficiently regulated. If we move further to the left, we have 219, which requires some kind of regulatory action. And then we have quite a large proportion, nearly 25%, where we've had to actually request more data. So the data in our databases are not that good. They could all be improved in some way. And so what we're left with is still nearly 2,700 in an uncertain area. And many of these we're going to have to ask for more information on. But the objective of this strategy is to move everything, all the registrations, from this grey circle to the other 4 circles. And then the same objective is then applied to the other group of substances, those below 100 tons a year. So our objective is to move from this uncertain area of the grey circle to the other 4. And eventually, even where we've requested more data, this dark orange circle, we still intend to move those substances further to the right. So eventually we will have as many as possible in the green zone or in the yellow zone. And this next slide is saying the same thing. So we're allocating all those substances to these pools, and we have specific deadlines in mind. So by 2020, we want to have all those substances registered above 100 tons a year. So that's a particular challenge for us. So that picture I showed you was 2018. So already this year, we've worked quite a lot on it. And we're still moving, and we have to try to meet this deadline next year. And by 2027, we want to have all the substances allocated to these pools. And the way that we're going to do it, so this is the machinery behind it. It's the top half of this diagram that is explaining how you get to those pools. And I won't go into detail because the diagram is quite detailed, but to say that in the middle top, we start with screening. We screen the data. And if we need more information, we have some mechanisms to get that information, and that's shown in the top right-hand of the diagram. Once we receive that information, we need to make a decision. Is there a concern? If there is no concern, you end up in the green zone, and no further action is required. If there is a concern, then it moves on to the next step, and so it's allocated into the pool where some kind of regulatory action has to be taken, and the bottom half of the diagram is showing the steps by which you decide which is the most appropriate action. You end up with either restriction, harmonized classification, or application for authorization in the end. So this is the ones that we normally do under REACH. We are at the moment considering whether OEL would be an appropriate regulatory action. We don't have a specific role in that at the moment of suggesting OELs, but the Commission can put forward OELs, and this might be an option for them. If the use is only in industrial settings, for example, this might be an appropriate way to control exposure. So, before I move on, one thing to say that we're doing differently now since last year than how we used to do it. We used to look at individual substances, or we used to look at hazard endpoints, and then try to determine how to move forward from there. What we do now is we group substances which have similar hazard profiles, similar uses, and similar exposures and the way they are used. And then we try to take group action against them. So we are trying to move more efficiently, more substances through this scheme, and at the same time to take consistent action against them. And I'm going to show you an example of one where we've taken action which was not actually working out as good as it could be in my future slides. So I move on to the regulatory action. So those are the mechanism by which we get to regulatory action. And now I'm going to give you some examples where we've taken action and how that action has resulted in exposure reduction in the main. So we have this example of hexavalent chromium. It's used in chrome plating. of articles, so metals and plastics amongst others. So your cars, household taps, things like this are all chrome-plated for this corrosion resistance or appearance. And when this substance ends up on the authorization list, there was also increased attention from the occupational safety side. So it was actually quite a good thing that everybody was looking at this, giving some increased attention to this particular use. And many companies actually started to improve what they were doing on site already, even before the authorization had to be applied for. Now, some companies left the market. ECHA gets criticized a lot for approving too many, or eventually it's the commission that grants the application, but it goes through ECHA, so people blame ECHA for granting too many applications, but actually many companies don't apply in the first place, and this is not really taken into account. At the same time, during this application process, there's an increased investment in R&D, and for some of the users, actually, if a substitute is available, authorizations will not be granted, and in some cases this occurred. So not all users are granted applications, and for some users, the actual time for the application was reduced from the requested one because there was a potential application and it was foreseen that it does require a certain time to implement it, but not as long as the applicant was requesting. And eventually we say that authorization supports the attainment of OELs and it reduces exposure. And I'll show in the next slide what I mean by that. A study was done in France of 11 sites where they took samples. And this has shown that the various tasks on that site resulted in these exposures. And some of those tasks resulted in exposures above the OEL, which is 10 micrograms per meter cubed. And there is a discussion to reduce that OEL ongoing. And basically, the applicants who did apply for the authorization committed to reducing it to 2 micrograms per meter cubed. So they've gone lower than the OEL. And they've said for themselves, they will commit to this level, and also for their customers. And what this actually means is that although it's a strange thing because now it looks like there's 2 levels, but basically if an enforcer goes to an industrial site and sees exposure above the 2 micrograms per meter cube, they're actually that site is in breach of the authorization conditions, so some action can be taken against them. So the applicants have actually reduced the exposure even lower than the OEL that is there. And there is discussion, for example, in France, that they're also going to reduce it even lower to maybe 1 micrograms per meter cube. So we have to see what happens if that happens. And then the application is for 2. We're not sure how that works together, and we have to see how that develops in the future. A second example we've got here resulted in substitution. And the first argument we always have is this substance has been used for decades. There is no possible substitute. If there was, we would have substituted already. And it turns out that no applications were received in this case, and a substitute was found, and everybody substituted. In Murano, the arsenic concentration in the air dropped by 98%. And again, it's contributed towards attaining the OEL in Murano, which was not possible to do before just from the background levels. And there's a study there that's talking about that. I've got a restriction example here. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the names of the substances or the tonnage itself because that data is confidential. So my colleagues who have made this slide for me have deleted that part of it, but I can tell you the gist of what it's telling you. So from 2011, there was a discussion on restriction of these 4 phthalates. And these phthalates were reprotoxic and endocrine disrupting. And 10 alternatives are actually indicated in the restriction, and they were monitored for their registration tonnages. So this is an example of where tonnage could be used, but it works because it's during the registration deadline. So 2010, 2013, 2018 all occurred during this period. So in there, you could see that there were increased registrations. But if you started doing it now in 2019 and what would be in 2029, we're not really sure what the data would show you. But in that period, we could see something. And what happened was that we saw that 2 substances, both of which were not classified as hazardous, one terephthalate and one cyclohexanoate, increase their registration quantities in this period. And these are the two that actually are the substitutes for these four phthalates. And so even by monitoring, we could actually see that this is what's happening. And in that light brown line, there's actually one big registrant that entered in 2013, and a second registrant made a registration in 2014, and after that, there was no update. So we can only assume that the tonnages remained around that same level. We don't get, by any particular reason, an update unless there's a change in the tonnage threshold of the registration, and that's the only reason that a registrant has to update their tonnage. Most of the time, we're asking for hazard data, and when new hazard data is provided, the tonnage is not normally updated. The data on tonnage we receive in the first place could be for 5 years, an average of the last 5 years, or only the quantity of that particular year that the registration was done. So we've got a very variable data that we get from registrants. And so we tend not to try to work on the tonnage in any meaningful way, but in this particular case, we could see something. And our data actually matched quite well with industry data in this case as well. So not completely, but not bad in this particular example. So the right-hand side is the industry data, and the left-hand side is our data. So another example. Now this is an example. So there's some good news of where we can see some substitution, some exposure reduction. This one potentially not so good news. So the intention was good. There's a restriction on BPA coming in 2020 in thermal paper. And so it was to give them time to phase out. And we've been monitoring in the meantime what's happening with the quantities. And what's happened is that BPS, the bisphenol S, has been indicated as a possible substitute. At the same time, it's kind of come under scrutiny at ECHA because it potentially has the same health issues. And so we're looking at that now. And there are some other alternatives to BPA, which has some other potential health issues. So what we end up in a situation here is called, what we in ECHA call regressible substitution. And so this is also one of the reasons why we're now looking at groups of substances. So if this was done now, we would not be having potentially a restriction just on BPA, but on all bisphenol substances that might have those particular properties that have that particular use. And there would be more of a group restriction. At least that is what is foreseen for the future. All right, so I can't tell what would come out. So maybe in the end, the data would say, okay, BPS is not as hazardous. And so, but the approach that we would take in processing would be looking at groups of substances that might lead to that, and the group would be then restricted. And there's a study again there that you can read. And so I've talked about the data, I've talked about the risk management actions we take and where they lead to risk reduction and where they work well and where they might not work so well. And now I'm going to move on to the substances which are not subject to regulatory action, how they are supposed to be used safely. And that's very much reliant on the manufacturer importer, the registrant, who generates this data, communicating it down the supply chain. And safety data sheets have been around for decades, and even now we still have a lot of complaints. There are a lot of errors in there, but at least people know them and know what is supposed to be there, and they're well understood. There is foreseen in REACH to have an upstream communication, but that relies on individual companies talking to each other, and that doesn't work so well. So they could give feedback on their uses or on whether the advice they receive is appropriate or not, and that's the part that's not working so well. A new aspect of REACH is the exposure scenario. So a registrant assesses the uses in this chemical safety report and tries to provide advice to the user on measures to take to control exposure. And this comes from the chemical safety assessment, so that the registrant is trying to put together information on the properties of substance and information on the uses, but actually the downstream user is the one that knows how to use it, and they're not always providing that information upstream. And so we foresee that the main capacity to do this assessment is at the top of the supply chain, And it's also more efficient that one registrant rather than 20 downstream users is doing it. There is a possibility for a downstream user to also do an assessment for users that are not covered by a registrant, but it does very much rely on an exchange of information, which is not really happening well. This diagram is not looking as it's supposed to, so I seem to have a similar issue to that, but I can actually skip over it. That this is what I meant about the assessment capacity. We've got a few manufacturers at the top. They know what they're doing, they have resources, they have the capacity, they have the expertise. We have formulators, some who would understand and some don't. And then at the bottom you have big downstream users who themselves might be registrants, manufacturers of chemicals, and they understand what they're doing, and they need some information. They can just say, okay, I'm in conformity with this or not. And then on the other side, we have these SMEs. Now, we consider they don't have, at least in the REACH, a capacity to do their own assessment. Potentially not under OSHA either. Everybody has to do some kind of assessment, and they might rely on information they receive and say, look, we comply with information we receive, so we are okay. We've got safe use. And so they're really relying on this information that comes down the supply chain. And this is the who we would focus on in any support that we provide. So just to recap, the registrant is focused at the top of the supply chain on complying with their obligations to do an assessment, to demonstrate control of risk, and then to communicate. And then they've got this complex supply chain. The diagram I showed earlier showed a very simple one, but in reality you have distributors, multiple suppliers with different impurities in your substances. You have formulators supplying formulators, so it's a complex supply chain and there's limited feedback. And so what we end up with is registrants copying and pasting their whole assessment, attaching it to the safety data sheet and sending it down the supply chain, and then formulators ending up with a volume of information they just cannot handle. If they've got 10 or 20 substances, they've got hundreds of pages for each substance, they just cannot manage. And then what ends up at the end of the supply chain with end users, they just can't understand what they're getting. So they're looking for simple information at the end of the supply chain, and they get 100 pages of an assessment which they don't understand and terminology that they don't understand. So what are we doing about that? So that's the bad news. Some good news. Last year already there was a review of REACH, and this was one of the recommendations for action to improve the workability and quality of extended safety data sheets. Working in 4 areas. One is user-targeted information. That includes what OSH practitioners need, what is needed on site for worker safety, electronic distribution. There's a lot of copying and pasting from PDFs by formulators. We're trying to move away from that. Minimum requirements for exposure scenarios. We've got a very detailed REACH legal text on safety data sheets, but not on exposure scenarios, so that information is different from different suppliers. And so what the person at the end of the supply chain receives is different from every supplier, and how are they supposed to make sense of that? So familiarity, having the same information all the time, helps understanding. And then last but not least, to develop a methodology for mixture safety data sheets. So again, there's a lot of issues for formulators, and we're trying to support them in that. And then this also relates to Action 12.1 in this REACH review, where we are supposed to enhance the use of REACH tools to enhance the effectiveness of OSH legislation. So, as I said, we've got to focus at the moment to try and support and integrate as much as possible in REACH and OSH. I mean, I'm here as well because I'm working in some groups at ECHA who are trying to integrate REACH and OSH. I work with the EU-OSHA, I work with the Slick Chemics Working Group. So we're really trying to integrate the 2 legislations. We're trying to promote this hierarchy of control within REACH as well. So the information that is passed down is actually making sense from an OSH point of view as well. At the moment, it doesn't always. You get exposure scenarios telling you can use RPE for 8 hours and things like that, and that should not be there. So we're trying to promote taking into account OSH principles as well while generating REACH information. And we have some tools already that we've developed over the years through this NS network, some templates, phrase catalogs, some methods to deal with substance safety data sheets and produce mixture safety data sheets. Also, this use maps tool to communicate upstream, and you can find that on the NS network page for more information, but basically these are voluntary tools and they have not been uptaken as much as they can be doing. So we're trying to promote that again through this REACH review action. And this is quite a detailed slide. I won't go through it in detail, but this is a scheme that we've come up with on how manufacturers or importers of substances interact with formulators of mixtures to the end users of the chemicals. The kind of information they should be communicating with each other. There are some tools already available, as I mentioned on the previous slide. There are some tools under development, and there are tools that are not yet in place that we need to work on. So we've got a 3-year project to try to get this system up and running, to get it working, to get the right kind of information at the end of the supply chain so that the users of the chemical can use those chemicals safely and reduce exposure. So that's almost my last slide. This is my last slide, some take-home messages. So REACH and COP, we consider that they contribute to exposure reduction. It's based on the knowledge and data that registrants provide, but that definitely needs to be improved. So authorities and industry are relying on that data, and there's quite a few activities to try to improve that data. The most hazardous substances will be subject to regulatory risk management, and that's going to come faster and harder in the future as we're trying to move those substances into the pools where we take regulatory action or no action. And so we've got our targets, and we have to see how that goes. And for the rest, we rely on clear information and understandable information being communicated down the supply chain to ensure safe use, and including for mixtures as well. So thank you for your attention. Sorry I was speaking fast and I was trying to get through and tried to save Lothar's time because I had quite a lot of information, and I'm happy if there were some questions later.
Yeah, thank you, Faisal. I only want to remind you that you can put your questions into Slido when they immediately come to your mind so that they are not forgotten. So now I'm curious to hear how industry prepares for now and the future. Stefan Engel will report on that. Let me see. And I find that immediately. Yeah, I improve. Be careful.
Oh, thank you, Lothar. Actually, I'm an occupational safety officer for my company, and actually I'm not sure if I'm supposed to speak in such a non-safe situation. No, but I crew. That's the upside, yeah. Thank you, Lothar. And of course, thank you very much also to OSHA for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Now, having heard about a more research-oriented project from IOM and about regulatory risk or regulatory aspects, I would like to invite you now to join me a little bit more into the daily routine of chemical industry. I'm speaking here on behalf of the German Chemical Industry Association. However, I'm working for BASF in Ludwigshafen. I also would like to share some thoughts on the challenges which we are facing in the second part of my presentation, so that's the content part. To get this doesn't look like it is supposed to look as well. Somehow they are missing some icons. This is really a pity, but I was always looking forward to such surprises because I learned from my predecessors that they had the same issue. Actually, I tell you what you should see. To get the journey started into some fundamentals of industrial hygiene to set the scene, I would like to get started with the role of OELs for industrial hygienists. For industrial hygienists, occupational exposure limit values play an important role. as they give them the opportunity to take a robust decision, on a quantitative basis. Unfortunately, we have not seen that the European Commission derived, and actually you should see an arrow here. Yes, actually it should look like that, like this. It's really a pity. Unfortunately, not many binding occupation exposure limit values were derived in the past, since.
You have a solution for that?
Yeah, if we can change a computer, yes.
No, let's just leave it. I think we'll leave it. Yeah. You can, if you would like to, you can later review it when it's uploaded to OSHA's webpage. I think so. So, unfortunately, not many or none binding occupation exposure limit values were derived until 2017, which is really a pity. Since then, European Commission published a series of binding occupational limit values on substances relevant for the market in a series of waves. Actually, you should see here 3 waves, and here you see the numbers of the substances or the binding occupation exposure limit values. And there you should have seen the 4th wave, which is ongoing, and here you should have seen the 5th wave. And now you should see the U-boat, this you can see really moving. Well, anyway, occupation exposure limit values play an important role. This looks like as it should be. Play an important role in the risk assessment process, which is depicted here on the right-hand side. The risk assessment was touched a couple of times already. The risk assessment process as such is sort of a workhorse for the industrial hygienist. It consists of several elements which are collecting information, collecting and assessing information. It is defining and implementing risk management measures, checking their effectiveness, and then it starts all over again in a continuous improvement process. However, collecting information for the first part of the risk assessment cycle is usually not an easy task. And we have heard that earlier in the plenary session, and it was touched here already as well. You need various information on different aspects. You need substance properties. We heard about that from the colleague here from ECHA, which is typically you need to know about physical chemical properties, you need to know about toxicological properties. I'm not talking about environmental properties because it's not the subject today. But this is not all. You also need to know more about the process conditions, what are process temperature and pressure, what are potential release sources which could possibly lead to exposure. You need to know about the work equipment, the work environment, the working task, and you should not forget, you also need to take into account the capabilities of your workforce. So what is their theoretical knowledge and what are their practical skills? So what they are really capable to deliver. The risk management measures, again, this was mentioned earlier as well, is based on the hierarchy of control. I don't want to go through everything in the hierarchy of control, which is well established and you're certainly well aware of, but I would like to point out and to highlight, and this was mentioned earlier as well, and we should not forget that information and training is crucial also as an organizational measure. And personal measures, it's not only the use of personal protective equipment, but also the behavior and the compliant behavior of the worker in operation. How does this look like in practice? I've brought you 2 examples here, just 2. What you can see here are 2 different working situations. However, it's the same operation. It's connecting and disconnecting of a transfer line to a tank container. Here you see the connecting and you see the worker on top of the tank container, and here you see the disconnecting of the transfer line from the tank container. What you immediately recognize that the workers do not use the same personal protective equipment, but this was decided based on an individual risk assessment. What counts here is that risk assessment, we are talking only about hazards caused by workplace risks caused by chemicals. However, we should not forget that industrial hygiene and occupational safety, they need to take into account all workplace hazards. In this example here, it's falling from height. It's actually the predominant workplace hazard, which could lead to severe accident or even to fatality if the worker falls down from the tank container. However, here, the exposure to chemicals is obviously not in the foreground. So all workplace hazards must be adequately controlled, and exposure to chemicals may in certain cases less critical as other workplace hazards. And we need very often, that is usual, the combination of different control measures to adequately protect the workers. Actually, the question is, are we done now? Then I could stop my talk or my presentation here, but obviously the answer is no, we are not done now, because we are challenged. We are challenged by the occupation exposure limit values, which industry really welcomes that they are derived. However, we also have to take note that they are continuously decreasing over time. And I've brought you 3 examples, which I will show you in a minute. And you see the first one already, and I would like also to share some experiences which we have made or make in Germany, where we use the risk acceptance model for carcinogenic substances. And you see here the German situation in the box in comparison to the European value. And here's the first example, that's acrylonitrile. And in 2005, we abolished all the technical guidance concentrations, and they were replaced by health-based occupation exposure limit values, and later, for carcinogens, by risk-based so-called tolerable and acceptable concentration. The tolerable concentration is sort of a compliance value. The acceptable concentration is sort of a target value. But what you can see is that we have a significant decrease from 2005 for the threshold limit value to today's situation. And you see the order of magnitude of the binding occupation exposure limit value in Europe. The same picture we have for benzene, it's similar. And the last example is nickel. And here you see, when you compare it to those here, that from 2005 to today, we are in the order of magnitude of 100 lower. The OEL is about a factor 100 lower than it was in 2005, and the European value is in a similar order of magnitude. However, the question, of course, is what is the consequence of this in the implementation in daily practice? And it's very obvious that this will have consequences, and I would like to highlight 2 aspects. The first one is, how can we monitor such values? And the second one, I will come to that, is what does this mean for control concepts? Getting started with the experiences, and these are all experiences from the German risk acceptance concept, which we implemented in 2015 in a pilot situation or in a pilot case. It's not finally regulatory binding, but it will become with the revision of the relevant piece of legislation in Germany, which is the Hazardous Chemicals Ordinance, probably next year. And what we first learned is that existing air monitoring methods, not all of them are really suitable to monitor air concentration, because the level of detection is not sufficient of those methods. And this is especially true for monitoring the acceptable concentration. You see the blue part here, those methods are not suitable at all, and so those are not fully suitable, so you need improvement. The other possibility to assess exposure is to use human biomonitoring. You do not need to be afraid of this one here. I try to talk you through it. For the example, benzene. Maybe if you're not so familiar with human biomonitoring, you do not know that the biological equivalence values, they depend on the OEL's on the OELs. They are derived on this basis. And what you see here are the biological equivalence values for the tolerable concentration and the acceptable concentration for a biomarker in creatinine. And I'm showing you this example because I would like to compare it. I would like to draw your attention to this box here, which gives you information about the background values of the general population, here depicted at the 95th percentile of this biomarker. And what you can see is that smokers, they exceed the acceptable concentration simply by smoking, because tobacco smoke contains benzene. So what we here reach is that the limit of quantification for human biomonitoring methods for benzene is similar to the background values of the general population. And the consequence is that we simply, for benzene, we partly lose this method for monitoring. So the message here is monitoring methods are partly not applicable anymore. We need to improve, at least for air monitoring, or in case of human biomonitoring, we may fully lose them because the values get so low. I would like to come to the second consequence, and this is what is the consequence for the control concepts. Can we continue as we did before? I've shown you an example earlier. Will that be possible in the future as well? What you see here is a concept which is well known in pharmaceutical industry. I'm not sure if you know this. It's the concept of occupation exposure bands. This concept correlates occupation exposure bands to certain air concentrations, which are depicted here. Yeah. So if you have an occupation exposure limit value, for example, in the range of 0.1 to 1 milligram per meter cubed, you should meet a control concept which complies with the occupation exposure band 2. What is clear is that, of course, the technical requirements will increase with higher OEB number, of course. When I now correlate the carcinogens and their acceptable and tolerable concentration to those OEBs, which we have in Germany, these are not the European values, but the German values, what you see is, and these are not all, this is just a selection, but what I wanted to show you is that we find that the acceptable and tolerable concentrations, you find them over the full range of the pyramid. But what does this mean in practice? In practice, it means that usually manufacturing industry, so chemical industry, what we are capable to do is really to meet the criteria of OEB1 and OEB2, occupation exposure band 1 and 2, according to this model. And this usually requires, and this is depicted here, usually it's technical ventilation, very often it's supplemented by local exhaust ventilation, and often you use closed equipment, but not always. But what is the situation for occupation exposure band 3 to 5? And this is different. If you need to meet occupation exposure levels in this arena here, you need to significantly improve. This requires really high-end solutions. You need to use closed equipment. This equipment is typically certified because it comes from, very often, it comes from pharmaceutical industry. So it's certified as being an OEB3 or OEB4 standard. In addition, if you have to work in OEB4 and 5, you need to use isolators. Otherwise, you will never meet such low release values. Of course, you also have to apply technical ventilation and additional ventilation methods. We know already the local exhaust ventilation here abbreviated, but it can be also high-end solutions like laminar downflow booth, which is a standard or is a technology coming from pharmaceutical industry. And very often you also need enclosure or secondary containment. So having said this, the question is, how does this look like? And this looks a little different, and I've brought you 3 examples. Here's the transparency with the first 2 examples. This is the loading of a solid into big bags or into small packages. And this here is something what you would classify as being an occupational exposure band 3 equipment. This is equipped with endless inliner systems. This is true here as well. This is big bag loading. This is filling of small packages. And if you go even further and you need to work in occupation exposure band 4, it may look like this. This is an example from pharmaceutical industry, which was kindly provided by a VCI member company in Germany. And what you do not see is the dryer. The dryer is behind here. This is the isolator, which is equipped like a glove box. Yeah, and the dryer is behind it. And in addition, what you see is, of course, personal protective equipment is used here as well. I cannot comment if it's required due to protective issue or it's simply maybe preventive. So the question, of course, is if this is the future also for chemical industry, and it will be interesting to discuss how other sectors will cope with this. Think of construction industry or others. So with this, I'd like to come to an end of my presentation already, and I'd like to conclude. What I would like to assure you is the safety and health is really very important. It's actually key for successful and sustainable production in German chemical industry. However, the continuously decreasing occupation exposure limit values are very challenging, and sometimes they may lead us to the limits of feasibility. And we need to discuss how we would like to manage this. This is the reason why we advocate for that the results of impact analyses, and this should include technical feasibility, must be considered in the process of setting occupation exposure limit values. And what I would like to add is that, of course, we advocate for that we apply the existing process, tripartite process, under the auspices of the Advisory Committee of Safety and Health also in the future. I think I've shown you that we need continuous improvement, at least for the monitoring methods, and we also need this for technical controls, and this includes R&D efforts. Because what I've not mentioned, if you buy an occupation exposure band classified apparatus, this is tested usually in pharmaceutical industry with lactose. But lactose doesn't behave necessarily like your product. So you really need to take a lot of effort to get that up and running in the mode as you wish it to be in your production facility. And finally, we need flexible combination of all types of controls. We are not challenging hierarchy of controls at all. However, we need this flexible combination, and this includes, in the end, also the use of personal protective equipment. This is necessary sometimes, and this also must be covered by the European legislation. With this, I'd like to stop, and I thank you for your kind attention, and I'm also looking forward for any questions which you may have. Thank you very much.
So, yeah, now we all listen to the three presentations. Thank you again for these presentations, which surely have costed you a lot of time to prepare. Before I open the floor for questions or discussions, be it here or via the Slido, I would like to ask our two panelists, Arndt Spahn from the Agricultural Workers and Christe Meesters from Business Europe, what is their view on current challenges and what should we do in future? Arndt, could you start on that?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the chance to speak here in the summit. The OSHA work is quite important, especially for sectors who are so small-scale like agriculture and who have a lot of problems and are mostly not able to find solutions for the problems we have. European agriculture means 17 million farms, 40 million people who are active working in this 17 million farms. There are more farms in Europe than all the other sectors together as enterprises. So only to give you an overview, it's less than one worker per farm in average. We have 10 million dependent worker in European agriculture. And that is the beginning of the problem, because if you ask the member states and Eurostat about how many people are active in agriculture, you are coming to direct different answers, because they use these statistical methods. We heard a lot of them today. They call it annual working unit. That means every worker has to work more than 1,850 hours per year. And as everyone knows, a lot of these workers we have in agriculture are seasonal workers. Workers who are leaving their countries, as an example, as migrant workers for 3 months, working in another country, harvesting and whatever, and then they go back. If you count them, then they give the European Commissions inform the European Parliament that there are working 2 million dependent workers in European agriculture. That means the statistical basic is totally different. If you look to the other sources we heard about, what you are using, what the experts are using, especially the studies from Eurofound, they are far away from reality. They are absolutely far away from reality. And we had 10 years ago a study from Eurofound about the situation of agricultural workers, where they didn't ask one agricultural worker. It was only a statistical study which was far away from reality. And this is our biggest problem. If you ask anyone who is responsible, how many people are active sprayers in your agriculture or in your forestry and so on, you never get an answer. You never get an answer. Nobody knows how many active workers are actively working with pesticides, and especially then, with what kind of pesticides? What are you using in a farm which is producing more than one culture, more than one product? So also not the farmers knows what they are using, because they are informed by these experts of the chemical industry, or, which is more dangerous, from the people who are selling you the products from the chemical industry. And this is a big problem. As an example, if our people, after 40 years of work, are going to the doctor and say, I have a problem and I believe it's a result of use of pesticides, which I was actively using more than 40 years, nobody knows how to identify the problem. There is no instrument in Europe or in a member state to collect the information on use of these dangerous pesticides. And then the next question is, what is a dangerous pesticide? Everyone see the discussion under the name of glyphosate and so on. Everyone is blaming the other, that the data are incorrect and whatever. And that means workers who are working with these structures, they feel very unsafe, they feel very unsecure, because first they are not informed about what kind of products they are using, what are the effects of these products, how they can document the use of this product. It's not all of them who are interested to document it, but there are a lot of critical people working in our sector who say, yes, I need an instrument to say, today I work with this stuff, next day I work with another, and so on. That means what we heard now is far away. It is not a critics on the panelists, but what we heard is far away from the reality of our sector. And I was really impressed from the example from the Spanish hairdressers today, who take over the responsibility and said, we are also a very small-scaled industry and production, and we take over the responsibility. We try to help our people. We try to substitute. It's a word which is not existing in agriculture. If we speak about the jury today, we have really to say we have a wonderful agriculture which substitutes chemical pesticide that we call organic farming, but nobody gives organic farming a price in European OSHA, because we pay the price with a lot of problems. We speak next year about it, if we speak about musculoskeletal disorders, which is the price the workers has to pay because they are not using these chemical helpers by day. And that means really, in the 70s, European trade unions developed a daily booklet for the workers, where they can write down what kind of stuff they are working. It's also very helpful for farmers. It's not only for workers. Until today, we didn't got the support from one member state to bring this under national legislation. There is no social security institution which take over the responsibility. Only France had the system where they try to identify first an homemade based information structure for the effects of using of pesticides in agriculture. So it is really important to identify this as an important area. It is absolutely true what was said here, to inform the workers about it. A lot of my job is only to translate the official information from these hundreds of pages to an understandable paper for workers. One of these products you have on your seats here, to make them understandable what is possible, what is the effect and what is the result they are working on it. As an example, today we speak in our sector a lot about African swine fever. There is no paper of governmental or veterinarian or responsible institutions which can be understood by an agricultural worker and hunter or whatever, or the people who are really close with these things. In my understanding, there is a big difference between BASF and my sector. BASF is a wonderful part of the chemical industry. It's one of more than thousands of chemical enterprises we have in Germany. I'm sure not everywhere in the chemical industry the situation is as well organized as in BASF, but you can say BASF, they are producing these stuffs, but they are so far away from our reality, but they are linked with this reality. So I'm asking BASF to help us, to support us, to inform the people who are using their products in the languages these people are speaking, in the way that people, today we saw a good example from Prevent from Sweden, as in where they are using instruments to work on communication way with this worker. We can learn a lot from this Swedish example. That means to take over the responsibility not only to people who are active in public services and responsible institutions, but really for the spot. Support the workers, support substitution, stop substitution. What does it mean in agriculture? There are a lot of possibilities to reduce the use of these stuffs. And if you speak about pesticides in agriculture, and I'm sure it's not only in agriculture, it's also in a lot of other small-scale industries, everyone is speaking about this personal protection scheme. The personal protection, you have to use gloves and whatever, and then everything is wonderful. That means we start at the end of the line. We didn't start with a big substitution and later with technical solutions, how to reduce the effects and whatever, organizational structures and activities and so on. No, we give it to the last one, to the weakest part of the chain. Please take your gloves and personal protection things and so on. And everyone knows this has nothing to do with a modern agriculture which believes they can feed the world. If we want to feed the world, we first have to save our people who are active there. Without this is not possible. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for this completely different view, let's say, on what's necessary now and in future. Last but not least, of course, Chris for...
Yeah, thank you. Well, already in my opening statement, I referred to the fact that chemicals are an essential part of our lives and will continue to be so in the future, in a sustainable future. And I think chemical industry and all other industries using chemicals will be part and maybe even the main part of the solution, driving us towards a more environmental friendly and climate friendly production, environment and economy. That means circular economy, closing loops. It will also mean that probably that we will develop further chemicals, new chemicals, whether they are now compounds or single substances, or are derived from processes. So it will remain a huge challenge, but for me the main challenge is to have this holistic approach. You have policy measures on one hand, on the other hand you have the people, the end users, or not even end users, are workers that are or could be exposed to chemicals, and the main challenge is how to connect all the dots together. For example, already referred to with good examples, the limit of an approach based on limit values. And what was not mentioned yet is the fact that, okay, sometimes you approach levels that are lower than background levels that you find in people, but what we're not talking about is in some countries there are not even reference laboratories. The methodology of taking samples is completely not in line with state-of-art technology. So what are you measuring? And are you even measuring at all? For the majority of companies, measuring is even out of the scope. So what we need to do is translate our mix, our policy mix of restrictions, the use of chemicals, allowing the use of chemicals, limit values, translating that in how work is done. That is what the majority of our companies that are smaller and medium-sized enterprises need. It's not about measuring there. It's about how should we work and how should we work tomorrow, because it's a continuous effort, because new methodologies are constantly developed, better ways of protecting people, but how do we work? So for policymakers, you should never stop at saying, okay, we have a new limit value, whether that is now binding or indicative. The next step is, as a policy maker, you should also engage in a process and make sure at the end there is also, how does all of that now translate into work practices? The hairdresser sector is maybe one of the best examples. You will get nowhere if you start deploying measurement apparature in hairdresser salons. It's about translating all of that into how do you have to work then, taking into account the hierarchy of prevention, but that's what needs to be done. We are constantly, or very often as policymakers, fooling ourselves by thinking that by setting a stricter limit value, we are better protecting people. No, that's theory. How does that translate into practice? We have seen examples. One was styrene. And we visited a company that makes silos for the food processing industry. So what was the thing with styrene? We had a new lower limit value with concentration in the air that makes it necessary to circulate more air, bring fresh air in, contaminated air out. But this company is making silos that have 10 meters of diameter, 30 meters long. So the air current that was needed, your papers would fly from your hands and maybe your hair would fly out. So you cannot work there anymore. And this is 30-meter silos. You cannot have a closed process. So your theoretical approach can never fly in reality. So I think that is the main challenge, bridge the gap between what is necessary from a policy at the level of policy measures, the combination of, as I said, restrictions, permits, limit values, but we have to translate that into work practices, how people work. And of course, bigger companies with expertise can help, but also know the companies, because for example, I think, but you can better speak for yourself, I think BASF makes little chemicals that are intended for use by end users. Mass volume chemicals that go to other parts of the industry. So they are not the ones who need to help the end users. So we have to understand the reality of, and it's branch specific, even company specific. In small companies where there is a batch process, we have seen examples where it was even impossible to find a solid measuring strategy, because in this atelier the work took place in all different corners and it changed continuously. So the guys who were setting up the measurement for taking the air samples, yeah, but now we have to change because now you're going to work there. Yeah, of course I'm not going to work there, and then I'm going to work there and there and there. So it was even impossible to have a sound measuring strategy. So for me, that is the main challenge, translate everything in how work is done. And I think the NEPSI agreement of the crystalline silica was a very good attempt, and still is, in translating, starting from limit values, translating into work practices. But if you continue to put pressure on the limit value, you're maybe destroying what works better in reality, the good practice, because now you're discouraging this branch of the industry, because every time they say, oh, we will make the limit value more strict, and then they say, well, we will stop investing in developing these good practices, in investing time, money, resources, and people in good practices that we push throughout the sector. We will stop, and yeah, it will be stricter limit values. And then, are we then helping the workers in reality if we cannot tell anymore how you should work? So this is for me the main challenge in holistic approach means policymakers look a little bit further and also assume responsibility for what happens afterwards in workplaces, together of course with the workers involved and with the employers involved in all branches of the economy where there is a possible exposure risk.
So thank you also to our two panelists. Now it's your chance, but we look first at our Slido questions. I have to dive down here a little bit. Does it work, Katalin? Oh, it's too close. I cannot see the questions.
Yes, I can see that. Well, you know, there are several approaches. Coming to the first question and the response to that, you know, there are several approaches that it can be more specific. You need to consider that this was just the piloting. What we were interested to see is whether it is possible not to see the potential in full. We have some idea in relation to the potential in full, and this is described within the published documents themselves. It can be further specific into certain solvents when you're saying also in relation to several cast numbers, I will presume that means likely mixtures. I'm aware, and maybe Facil can actually correct me on that, but I'm aware that some mixtures are ended as a combination of cast numbers within the registries.
Technically, they are not mixtures with UVCBs.
Yeah, okay.
They are substances, but made up of
several compounds. Yes. So there are some further possibilities. We haven't explored that in full in this first initial piloting. I hope that this answers this first question. In relation to the second question, I'm not sure that I understand the question, to be honest. Though that it's
Charter in the printing industry.
yes. No, I was not aware of that. But you know, the dunk solvents probably dangerous. Yeah. Okay. Well, you know. First of all, when it comes into the printing, you should consider also that besides the solvents itself that they're used, it includes some further, emissions, for example, of nanomaterials that they're used within, which goes a bit further than that, which makes printing itself as very important. And another concern that actually this that it was highlighted during this identification process, which I think is also highly relevant, is that printers are now in our homes, not only in our workplaces.
Okay, so. Oh, there's another question? Yeah. Oh, okay. You can see that, Stefan? Is it possible to have more documents on the German method exposed this afternoon, where to find them? Do you have some links already in your presentation, Stefan? Huh?
No, there is no link in the presentation. I'm not so sure what exactly is meant by the German method exposed this afternoon. Is the risk acceptance model what is meant here? This is published on the homepage of the German NIOSH. Maybe Rolf Packhoff can help. He's working for German NIOSH, and you would find it there. I think this document, this is technical guidance document 910, is translated to English, but I'm not 100% sure because everything is in German, you know. Yeah, but I think this one is available in English. I'm not absolutely certain. Do you know this? No. Technical guidance 910. Or we are talking about technical THS 910. This is available in English, isn't it? Yeah. Or are you talking about the occupation exposure band method? Both. There are some monographs available, very expensive literature, by the way. You pay several hundred of euros to buy it, but I could provide 2 or 3 links. These are more or less textbooks. Yeah, but they are quite general, not answering possibly your individual question for your individual workplace. Yeah, they are more general textbooks. But if you're interested, I can provide it to Lothar and maybe he can provide it to the audience.
Yeah, we have still 15 minutes for your opinion, statements, questions. Use the chance that these speakers from very different organizations, institutions are here. Oh, the people like to write.
The next question is, I guess it's to everyone.
We cannot see it now. No. What do you think about this? Are you reluctant?
Well, we are social partners, we are not research institutes. We participate in development of research programs. We give our opinions, we give advice to the public research programs that are developed. And we try to include as much as possible health and safety related research topics in our national research agenda. But we are not the ones doing the research, of course.
Maybe there are some really good examples. In the European Social Dialogue in Agriculture, we asked together as employers and employees, how is it possible to protect the people who are tractorists, who are working in tractors against the dust by using chemical pesticides. And there we had a very strong discussion with the producers of tractors and agricultural machineries, because there are possibilities to input and filter 4 cabine on these tractors. And this is made now in America because there is a strong pressure behind, because there are lawyers and who are looking that the people are better protected. In Europe, we don't have one country where this is a standard, and it's also not a standard in the discussion of the European Commission to develop this under health and safety frame. That means there are a lot of possibilities, and it is especially not acceptable that people are sitting in a tractor cabine closed, and they have to use a personal protection scheme against the dust of pesticides which they have in the background of the tractor. So there are a lot of possibilities, and responsibilities, and the social partners take over these responsibilities as long they get a support for this. But the reality is really a little bit different. Look to this country to see what is the reality of the use of chemical pesticides in agriculture. Then you have really to go to Andalusia and look what the reality is there. And everyone saw it in the television. Everyone in this room knows about the reality in this sector. And it is, they knew, I'm sure you knew it also 10 years before. But what changed? What happened? And this is also our responsibility. We ask the consumers to change their consumption and whatever, but everyone is looking and nobody's taking over the responsibility. And then I'm blaming, and it's also, of course, not very nice, but it's a reality. And I'm sure it's not only in agriculture. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe a quick addition. One of the things we run also into is we get a lot of requests from the OSH community to do further research on specific topics. But where we have a problem is, and not just us as the employers, the same goes for the workers group, is that those same people are a privileged partner of employers and are being paid by employers since decades. In the Framework Directive, it's Article 7, the external OSH experts in Belgium since organized, institutionalized occupational medicine since 1967. Every time we ask, yeah, but first we would like to see all the data that you gathered during those decades, from health surveillance, from measurement, from all the company visits that you have done. They are not able to show us anything. So what did you do with their money? That is where we have a problem. What happened? They have been telling for years and years, people, you're fit to work, but all the rest, they should have looked into the risks, into the type of work, into exposure. All of that should be in files, and I hope by now should be in database. Oh no, we don't have it, or we don't want to share it. That is where we have a problem.
Johannes, you have...
Well, I would just like to add that, you know, it's I think personally good communication will and information is the key, and NEPSI, that was already mentioned before, is a very good example to show what is possible. NEPSI, besides being a cross-industry initiative, it includes the industry, the employers, it includes the employees, it includes research also, where actually you have, to my knowledge, at least a very, very thorough and large campaign of monitoring of the changes and the exposures within that. I know colleagues from the Netherlands who actually are heavily involved in this. This is important information, but not only in relation to the effectiveness of the measures and any changes that are being applied, also in relation to the further contribution in relation to the potential health effects of silica and in relation to the working environments that they're involved there. And I think that such initiatives, they should be encouraged. And going back into what I mentioned when I was doing my presentation, it's really a pity that the construction industry has not contributed into this initiative.
Okay, I would like to take you have two more questions. That might be that.
And then I got the link from Bilbao.
We are at the forefront of technological development here. So everybody can have this link now, not only you, with this Slido system?
Yeah, I
Oh,
will
wow.
show it. So
Yeah.
it will appear there, but maybe you have to...
Yeah.
You have to scroll maybe, because I don't know how to
Yeah.
the answer questions.
So, I can't see it on the... Oh, they switched up. So, the next question is on the ECHA. You can see it on your screens, or can you scroll down somehow on this?
I can see.
Yeah, you can see. Okay, then, please.
Binding guidance. Okay, I'm not sure about that. So, but I can try to answer this question. During this REACH Review Action 3, our feedback from industry, from IT providers and so on, is that they would like to have legal clarification on what should be there. And so they're asking for some kind of legal text. Now, during the course of running these projects, we're trying to find out what is the best way to get those changes implemented. So there might be some legal text, there might be guidance, and so on. So not a binding guidance, but the guidance is always related to what we would recommend people do. And if there is a legal text behind as well, that supports that. So we're looking at 2 more years in this project, and by the end of that 2 years, Commission is the one that writes the legal text, and they are ready to write legal text for exposure scenarios, but we want to find out what the solution is. What is information that should be coming out? What is information that end users, SMEs, for example, need? And that's the part that we're working on now, and once we've clarified that, once we've tested that, once we've said, okay, this works, and we get the feedback from the testing that this is the kind of information they want, I think that's the point where some kind of legal text is coming and associated guidance.
Okay. Oh, so more? Sorry.
No, we said 2 to 3 years we're looking at before we get to that stage.
There is another about low concentration.
Yeah, this is not directed to any concrete person. I'm sure that everybody can say something on that. Perhaps we can combine that with a kind of final statement. Our network event starts at 7:30, so I want to give the participant the chance not to run to the hotel and then run back. So who wants to take the responsibility to say something on low concentration, long-term effects? Is that?
Well, I think, the long-term effects in general, not only on the low concentrations, is an issue, simply because, coming back also on the glyphosate discussion, we lack a lot of data, epidemiological data and human data in relation to this, and retrospective epidemiology has limitations. More research is needed there, and that's where it comes again to this issue of having collaboration between the different partners within this. That will be from my side,
Okay, so you started for a longer. Yeah, please.
Yeah, on the long-term effects, low concentration, well, the only case that in our occupational disease fund, there is a scientific board. The only case that we studied over the past years was the well-known example, the well-discussed case of the cabin air, so pilots and flight attendants, exposure to, I think it's solvents or oil. Yeah, and there is even a movie about that, etc. And there is an ex-pilot touring the whole world with their case. The only thing I can say is, because I'm just an observer in the scientific board, that the scientists, they studied all the reference material from the case, plus all the other materials they had, and they found that there are big holes and big loopholes in the documents presented to defend that case. And that for that particular type of exposure, there was no significant evidence that further action should be taken. And this is, of course, a population where epidemiological studies, cohort studies, are quite easy to do, because you're targeting just the pilots and the flight attendants. You clearly know who they are. There is health monitoring, etc., etc. But of course, for other types of exposure to low concentrations, it would be much more difficult to identify the people exposed. There would be no clear professions that are more exposed. So, but there is one case, and that's the only thing I can tell about that.
So, Stefan, you have not been addressed. Would you like something of a statement, or this question, or
General?
Actually, I wanted to add to this question. I'm not so sure about exactly the question, but the long-term effects are actually addressed in the toxicological testing, which is of course regulated by REACH, and this is of course depending on the volumes produced, and this is exactly the answer to the question, because these are the toxicological endpoints which are in focus. So this is actually addressed. So I think this is covered and this is managed. For me, as I said earlier, the question is more how can we implement it more effectively into practice. This is challenging. I understand that the chemical industry is maybe of course, in a different situation as other business sectors. However, I think the first step is, every journey starts with the first step, and so again, I would also like to take the opportunity to congratulate OSHA on the campaign, because the first step is to raise the awareness, to inform, and then to strengthen expertise on a broader basis, because this is also my experience from different discussions that we lack experts in the field, and we badly require them to better support and advise within companies, to SMEs, to wherever. And I think we have not touched this discussion today a lot. It was not in the focus. How can REACH and OSH cooperate? This has not been maybe the optimum solution so far. Yeah, I think REACH provides a lot of information on the hazard profile on substances, which is really helpful. And on the other hand, OSH is focusing always on the individual workplace and is not standardizing, which is the REACH approach to handle that many substances. And we need to find a way how to combine this and to proceed with it. And I think that can be really beneficial to all. So maybe this is it for now from my side. Thank you.
Okay, it's close to 1 minute before we close, so it's perfect timing. Thank you again for these contributions and responding to the questions. And we had no daylight today, but outside was also not much daylight, I believe. One short question from my side. I saw you like this Slido. Is this a good idea to give everyone the chance to ask questions? Even yeah. Okay. So, and it worked. We are quite happy. So thank you for listening to us. Thank you to the speakers and the panelists. And you saw the variety of ideas, of challenges, of the future that the people imagine, that they are afraid of, or that they think that would be a good solution. So I hope I see you at the network event, the museum behind this building, 19:30, and tomorrow 9:30, so the one away, 9:30 back in the plenary session. Thank you again, and let's have a good night. I heard something about folklore dancing or so you do something against the whole sitting all the day.
Lothar, is this a formal? Lothar, is the social networking a formal event, or what is the dress code for tonight?
The dress code is less formal than now.
Okay, thank you.